Hello. Okay, good morning, everyone. May I please ask of you to come closer, because as you see, we have a lot of empty spaces here. We'd like you to be closer so we can interact more closely with you. My name is Maya Asaf Horstmeyer, and I'm the Peacebuilding and Conflict Sensitivity Director of World Vision International. Please excuse my squeaky voice. 2 days ago, I had no voice whatsoever, so I feel lucky today to be able to moderate the session. Our session today will touch on the role of conflict sensitivity in the humanitarian development and peace-building nexus. So just to give you a bit of background on the session, today, humanitarian and development professionals are faced with some of the most challenging and complex circumstances in history. Conflicts are becoming increasingly protracted. Climate-related shocks are becoming more intense and more frequent. The splintering of rebel, tribal, and extremist groups across the globe is on the rise, permeating the dynamics of conflict itself. All those factors contribute to a cycle of vulnerability. In response to those challenges, the concept of the humanitarian development and peace nexus was developed. The concept focuses on the work needed to coherently address people's vulnerability before, during, and after a crisis. The idea of the nexus obviously was not new when it was born. It built on long-running efforts in the humanitarian and development fields, such as DRR, disaster risk reduction, linking relief, rehabilitation, and development, the resilience agenda, and the embedding of conflict sensitivity across responses. While the notion of the HDPN, or the Humanitarian Development and Peace Nexus, is gaining more ground, it comes with challenges, of course. Where long-term development goals are prioritized across the whole system, there's a risk that immediate humanitarian needs will not receive adequate responses. On the other hand, prioritizing humanitarian assistance across a response, as happens in many protracted crises, might risk failing to strengthen local systems to accountably provide essential social services and prevent and prepare for future crises. It can also lead to ignoring the systemic causes of conflict and vulnerability, including poverty, inequality, and the lack of functioning systems. It can potentially even weaken existing systems by bypassing them. Similarly, if we seek to focus on future conflict prevention, we must implement responses that address the root causes of conflict and ensure a holistic, conflict-sensitive approach from design to implementation. So today, World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, Relief International, and MSI will share examples from South Sudan, Myanmar, and other contexts in working across the humanitarian, peace-building, and development nexus using varied approach to conflict sensitivity. The session will explore complementarities, gaps, and potential for coherence in those approaches through the integration of conflict sensitivity. So I would like to introduce the great panel here with me. First of all, we have Mike O'Brien. Hi, Mike. He's the Director for Health and Nutrition for Relief International. Then we have Jennifer Ullman. She's the Technical Director for Peace and Stability from Management Systems International. Then we have Mesfin Loha, who's the Country Director of World Vision in South Sudan. And then last but not least, we have Robert Grolisma, the cross-sectoral development expert in Catholic Relief Services. So please allow me to welcome this amazing group of panelists who will share their experiences with us from across the globe. So first of all, I want to ask you, Mike, could you share with us your field experience on integrating conflict sensitivity in a restricted humanitarian space, and what was the impact of that?
Thanks, Maya. Yeah, so I get to talk about the humanitarian stuff, which is fun. If you don't know about Relief International, I'll just tell you real quick because not many people know about us. We are a relief and development organization, work in multiple sectors, but health is probably our largest, and we work in conflict, violent affected states. We do about 3 million, we provide or support about 3 million clinical consultations a year in about 500 different clinics. So very tough circumstances in some of the places that we work. And one of those areas, one of the countries that we work in and have been operational for a while is Myanmar. And usually when humanitarian organizations go in, we're not going in necessarily for a peace building project or stability or the long term. We want to deliver services. We want to make sure that the services get there when they're needed, right? It's life-saving. So we look at our humanitarian principles of neutrality, independence, impartiality, humanity. We really want to make sure that we uphold those so that we get our access. We maintain our access. But to keep our access for the longer period of time, sometimes we have to take a different point of view and look at what we're doing through a different lens. So that's kind of what we did in Myanmar. And just to paint a little bit of the picture for Myanmar for the conflict, Myanmar was under colonial British rule until 1948 when they got their independence. During colonial British rule, there were about 30 different principalities that were able to act sort of autonomously. And that was sort of agreed upon that they would still have that autonomy after independence, but that wasn't the case. So in 1949, there was a civil war, which just led to more militarization of the country. And as the military got stronger, the services provided became less. And in a few different areas, these ethnic armed groups, they became more formalized. And they actually took on some of the roles and services that normally a government would take on, and health services being one of those. So when we went into, let's see, in 2015, the national ceasefire agreement was signed for Myanmar. And Shan was one of those states where they agreed to the peace ceasefire agreement. And Relief International wanted to go in, and we wanted to go in, and you can see basically from the title there, we wanted to deliver essential health services to the people of Shan State. But we knew going in, because of the existing conflict, that if we went in, and as you go in, and if you're supporting the Ministry of Health, you're legitimizing basically that government. So whichever sort of person that you decide you're going to work with, you're kind of saying this is the legitimate authority to provide these services. And health is actually, seen as a function of the state. So we said, okay, we need to really take a look at this, not really for longer peace building, but to actually have our access and to be able to maintain our access. So what we did is we went through and we looked at our activities. And based on our activities, we looked and we saw what were the positive connectors and what were the negative connectors to the different stakeholders, basically, in South Shan. And you can see some of the three main stakeholders, basically, that we worked with, or we looked at these connectors, was the Ministry of Health or the government. We also looked at the South Shan Army and the POW. Those were the ethnic armed groups who also had ethnic health organizations under them, basically providing these types of services. And each one was really operating autonomously in its own different areas. So based on those different connectors, positive or negative, we put together our mitigation framework so that we knew how to sort of address some of those issues. But you know, this was done really with a lot of local input because they had the local knowledge to be able to say, okay, well, this is going to help, this is going to actually hurt through our activities. And we've had some really good success. So that was 2015. This was done as a humanitarian project to deliver access and services. But now we're going on another iteration of this project, and we expect to continue sort of the next iteration and the next iteration all the way up until 2022. So what was sort of done as a humanitarian project has now sort of become this sort of development. Now we're also building in local health system strengthening and capacity building through the project as well. So some of the successes have been pretty remarkable. Before the project, we saw about 60% vaccination rates in different townships, which are now up to 100% vaccination rates. And you can see the quote up here by one of the midwives, which is basically saying, you know, before this project, I wasn't able to have access to the population. But now they actually come to me and they let me provide my services, which is pretty interesting because, you know, if you see your enemy there and they're providing health services and you have a very sick child, maybe you'll take your very sick child to that health services. But if your enemy comes to your door and basically wants to inject your child with some unknown substance, you're probably going to be a little bit hesitant. So that's why actually increased vaccination rates are very interesting in this kind of context. Yeah, so that's basically how we've taken it from the humanitarian side and actually put a conflict sensitivity lens around it, and we're able to actually move this further on down to development.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That was really interesting. Jennifer, you have a slightly different experience in the integration of conflict sensitivity. I know in MSI you look a little bit more at that in the development arena, but you also look at conflict sensitivity beyond programming, right? You look at it cross-organizationally. So can you tell us a bit about your experience with that?
Sure, thanks, Maya. So Management Systems International, MSI for short, we are mostly a development, or focus on the development industry from a cross-sector perspective. So we work in anti-corruption, we work in education and agriculture, and certainly in conflict, crime, organized crime, and the violent extremism space, as well as more traditional conflict and peace building. Admittedly, we are less on the peace building spectrum and more on the conflict mitigation, conflict sensitivity spectrum. And I'll share with you a couple of examples of that that are a little bit more programmatic. So one example is in Indonesia. We have a violent extremism program, a countering violent extremism program. I wish it was a peace-building program. However, the people that pay have named it as such. And the program was starting up, and we said, you know, both the USAID mission and MSI during the startup phase said, you know, we really want to ensure that conflict sensitivity is embedded in this program because we're talking about some very sensitive topics. Not everyone in this country actually acknowledges extremism as an issue, nor do they necessarily acknowledge conflict dynamics as a concern. So how do we go about this in a conflict-sensitive manner? And I'm just going to share, we're still at the beginning stages of that project, so I'm not going to get into detail, and I don't have great outcomes and results to share with you yet, hopefully next year. But for now, I'd just like to share with you one thing we did during startup, which was to build in some conflict sensitivity training. Of course, you can't stop there. Training is training. But we not only we did more of like a workshop with our staff. Every single staff member was present. the finance folks, the chief of party, the field folk, people who are out in the rural areas in our different regions, everyone came together, and we started off the session in just talking about Indonesia, talking about the different areas of Indonesia, talking about all the wonderful diversity that is represented in that country. And our staff is a very inclusive staff of that diversity. And we just started talking about the conflict dynamics. Not unusual for probably many of you. But the one thing I want to share that came out of that is the staff themselves, as they started to identify those dynamics, they started to identify their experiences. And the experiences that they had that might impact how they view extremism, how they view perhaps certain groups in their country, their neighbors, or in other regions. And they started to share some of their own histories. And that sharing of their own histories and the relativity to the existing conflict dynamics was extremely powerful. And that sharing just really set the stage. It helped them identify their own biases. It helped them think about what their own perspectives are, whether it was built on a societal norm or a family value that was kind of embedded in them. And it just allowed them to start at a really grounded, just in a really grounded fashion, so that they could take that and understand what the perceptions of other groups, religions, ethnicities, genders, age groups were feeling and thinking. And that session during the startup phase was really invaluable, and it is carrying through all of their work in every aspect. So that was just one terrific experience we've had so far on that. Then I'd like to, so that is what I would call a traditional development project where we're integrating a conflict-sensitive lens, and hopefully one day in this 5-year stretch, contributing to peace. It's not going to be a peace-building program, but we are somehow contributing to peace writ little in certain areas of Indonesia. Next, I'd like to talk about DRC. So we have a program in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it is a peace-building program. Again, it is funded by USAID. And this program is wonderful. It's a wonderful participatory program. For how many of you in the room have worked in the Congo in some way, shape, or form? Okay, a good number of you. So I think many of you can understand for those of you who have worked there, you understand the very complex dynamics present. You have to think in a very proactive, preventative way. Corruption, it's a country wrought with corruption. So you have to expect that you will have corrupt practices in your program. And how are you going to handle those in a conflict-sensitive manner that will be acceptable to both your donor and acceptable to your staff, and legal in the DRC and legal per the US, right? So things like I'm talking about a peace-building program and yet talking about, corruption. Well, I'm just giving you an example of the types of things that you have to consider in a conflict-sensitive manner. How you're going to approach that, how you're going to approach conversations, thinking about the connections of your staff, who you're hiring, and so forth. One other aspect of the program, and there are, see if I can see the, okay, so you have some of the, what we did in the program. I'm just going to go over the first line because this has really influenced, the first year was a disaster, I'm not going to lie. We just didn't have the right staff in place, we didn't have the right leadership in place, We didn't and I want to say, I'm sorry, I should have said this up front, that it is a true partnership. It is not just an MSI program. This is an IRC, International Alert MSI program. It is truly, truly a partnership across all three. And it has, that in and of itself requires conflict-sensitive approaches too, in figuring out how to collaborate in such a robust way. Anyway, I just want to mention that first aspect of the DRC program that is relative to analysis. I know all of us talk about conflict analysis, context analysis, and how important it is. I just want to share one example of where oftentimes you have someone who an expert who comes in, usually, you know, an external expert who comes in who has been studying academically the country for years, and they're doing this conflict analysis, and then you're supposed to apply it. Well, we've tried that. It doesn't work. You really need a participatory team from the context who is part of that analysis. So in this project, we worked with USAID to redefine the scope a bit in what they were expecting. And so we conducted a series of 70 very localized, at the group level, conflict analyses, obviously in the areas in which we were working in North and South Kivu, and then took those, and again, those were very participatory workshops from the local community, and then took those, I don't want to overuse the term scale up, but kind of scaled that up a bit, and used local researches, again, from these areas and territories, to then take clusters of these localized analyses and kind of do a meta-analysis and showing what were those key dynamics at the district level. Then USAID wanted us to take it one step up from there and do a single conflict analysis of the region. We kind of pushed back on that, and we said, look, I'm not sure that's going to do any good because the dynamics are so unique in each of these areas, and we really want to work at the localized level. They agreed. They have been very flexible and adaptable throughout the whole program. We have a manager at USAID who is a local and comes out and visits the field all the time, and which I know is a rarity. And it's just been a terrific partnership. There's the next slide has a number of different achievements that have come out of this. And like I said, the first year truly was a disaster, but we learned, you know, that we had to just take a much more, even though it was a peace-building program, we weren't necessarily taking a full conflict-sensitive approach at the beginning. And I just want to emphasize that because not all peace-building programs are conflict-sensitive by nature or by design. And so we learned our kind of lessons first year, started to integrate that more year two with the help of our USAID and partnership across all of our partners with IRC and Alert, and it came out to be quite a success. And now we're just finished our third year, and we're putting in place 2 more option years. So I'll pause there. I do want to just also note, if I have a minute, one other thing is that I was supposed to also speak to what USAID is doing in terms of conflict sensitivity. And the only reason I'm speaking to that is because we've been helping them with developing what's called a conflict-sensitive aid course. And also in the midst of developing a guide to conflict sensitivity. This is new for the agency, but it is wonderful. They are thinking about, you know, mainstreaming conflict sensitivity and prevention. Those of you familiar with USAID, you know, the current Dacha Bureau is going to be reorganized, and I won't get into the details of that, but just to note that that reorganization is really focusing on prevention. And I don't want to sound like this big advocate of USAID. I'm not a representative at all. However, I do want to note the effort that's being made to contribute to conflict sensitivity and to peace building for that matter. So hopefully we can all move that forward.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jen, for sharing those experiences and insights. Excuse me. Mesfin, I know that World Vision has come up with a new programming approach for working across the Nexus, and that is the Fragile Context Programming approach, I believe. And I know from your experience in South Sudan as well that the FCPA has allowed for conflict-sensitive approaches. So can you share that a little bit with us? We would love to hear about that approach and your experiences in South Sudan.
Thank you, Maya. South Sudan's recent conflict that erupted in December 2013 have led to the fleeing of over 4 million of people. About 2.4 million of them taking refuge in neighboring countries, about 1.7, and with the new current estimate, about 1.4 in IDP camps in the country. And at the moment, close to 200,000 are in what's called protection of civilian centers, POC sites, that are managed by the UN. The gravity of the conflict and its impact on the population is severe. Anybody who reads or knows about South Sudan can use whatever superlative to describe the gravity of the problem and what the people have been through over the last 5 years, 6 years. So in any definition of fragility, South Sudan qualifies. It's either number 1 or number 2, sometimes number 3. But it also depends on which parameters we see. It's a fragile state. It's a fragile context. When we started this conversation, we said there should be a way to make things work. Whether in a fragile state or not, in a fragile context or not, not everything is fragile. We know when something is classified as fragile, we usually say handle with care, like we see in our packages, handle with care. But for fragile states and doing humanitarian development work, I say a better combination of the head, the heart, and the hand can make a difference, so that not everything becomes fragile. There is a way to do it. There must be a way to do a better work, a good work. So within this context, what are some of the things, what are some of the changes we should be thinking to bring into our common way of doing programs? It generated conversations within the organization. We cannot succeed if we projectize the issue, if it's project-based, if it's a time-bound, canvassed in a very tight log frame over 6 months or 1 year. It will not work if we continue with that approach. Because whatever number of assumptions you can bring into the project design, this context changes by the day. Every day, there is no dull day in programming in such context. So the idea was, how can we always ensure, have in the background, building social capital so that we can talk about, we can work on bringing transformational change, at the same time beginning with where the communities are. So the idea of an adaptive approach while considering the bigger picture of ensuring transformational change happens, but we have the adaptability based on continuous assessment of the context and also the impact. This doesn't happen if it is a time-bound project approach with sometimes very strict donors. A change in an intervention will require 3 months, 4 months to get it approved. So what are the mechanisms we can put in place to make these things work is we initially did an assessment, a readiness assessment. Even if donors or partners or funding is not a problem, are our systems flexible enough? Do we have the required readiness in our system, in our human resource systems, in our procurement systems, in our logistics and IT even systems to help us get into more adaptive, changing by the day programming? So various considerations were put in place to come up with this approach of adapting as the needs arise, as changes come every day. Sometimes you just design a program, you agree on the issue, design a program, and 2 weeks later you will have about 1,000 people who just got displaced and come into that program area that require additional needs. It's additional human resources, additional program interventions, maybe age-specific interventions, gender-specific interventions, even specific for the locations kind of interventions. So a system that allows, first of all, to start where people are, where the needs are, and immediately start with provision of immediate needs, support, and help at the starting point. Also building on the hope. For example, everywhere in South Sudan, people at the moment are very hopeful because of the revitalized peace agreement that was signed last year. They haven't seen the dividend yet, all of the dividend yet, but there are good progress that is being made and people have hope. So we build on that hope to encourage people to understand what changes can come and then make adjustment accordingly. The return and reintegration agenda is big at the moment because people would like to go to their areas of location. It means all humanitarian development actors should be on their toes to address to these emerging needs that come from time to time. So just an example from a program we are running with children formerly associated with armed forces and groups in Western Equatoria, how this engagement of different actors in the country along the Nexus helped in regularly changing the program, at the same time trying to achieve the various objectives. From initial negotiations for the release with armed forces, which is normally led by UN team, the UNMISS, UN mission for South Sudan. But after force protection was organized, logistics and everything was organized, the leaders of the armed forces refused to talk to anybody else except the faith leaders. And in that plan, the UN and others had to come out of it because they wouldn't approve such a trip in the name of this negotiation to that particular location. But this is again going beyond and beyond the limits. But the faith actors initially, the faith leaders in the area went and had this initial negotiation and initial agreement on the release was done just with that faith actors, the faith leaders only. And after the children, some as young as 9, 10 years, who have been with the group for many years, boys and girls, a big number, over 300 or so girls, as young as 11, 12, 13, 14, some with babies, some pregnant, that were released. And it becomes a day-to-day, everybody on their toes kind of approach. The conventional project designed for the release of armed children from armed groups will not work if you are not able to change on daily basis. The first problem we had was who works as a social worker engaging with these children became a problem because communities where the children came into refused, the same people, same ethnic group, same language, who are originally from the other side, where the children were taken into, abducted into. So it was a big move between UNICEF and World Vision to make adjustment on who should be able to work on this program, especially on some of these social work, community engagement kind of positions. And it means new recruitment, it means new training, it means new capacity building, it means new resources. We don't have time to have all of this through a rigorous process of change and approval and etc. We have to make those changes, otherwise this program wouldn't succeed, wouldn't go at all. And then along the way, even within the project, the program design itself, there are like several changes being made on a weekly basis. For example, the need for the newborns became an issue. We have the girls in vocational training, economic reintegration program, but they have young babies, nobody to take care of them. And we had to adjust in terms of additional interventions, additional workforce, so that they can still continue with the reintegration program. And then longer term, again, economic reintegration, small business training. It's over 2 years of programming, but without an approach that is agreed and understood with all stakeholders on the ground and the partners and donors, these kinds of programs cannot succeed, will not succeed. So what, in short, this approach, some of you might ask, shouldn't this be business as usual? Shouldn't this be the basics of program development and implementation? Unfortunately, it is, but it is not also. It is not happening in such a way. That's why the idea of adaptability, the capability to have agile arrangements and systems in place to respond to such changes, especially in such context, is critical. So the main message, this is a common sense, this is a common practice, it must be a common practice, but let's make common sense more common in programming in a conflict-sensitive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mesfin. That was really insightful. We're still in South Sudan, but we're zooming in a little bit more onto Jonglei State. Is that correct? And we're looking at a program that CRS has done on trauma healing. So, Robert, can you tell us a little bit more how this program was able to contribute to conflict-sensitive resilience?
I'll do my best. Good morning. I hope you're all well and enjoying the PeaceCon and learning a lot from it, as I am. In listening to Mike, Jen, and Mesfin, I was thinking, you know, they're all interesting cases, Myanmar, DRC, South Sudan. You can learn a lot. At my age, I was thinking, you know, you sometimes think, how much more is there to learn, right? But it seems like with conflict sensitivity mainstreaming, the learning never stops. I just keep learning new things all the time, which is a good thing. So I would like to talk about CRS's resilience strengthening program in Jonglei State of South Sudan and talk about the story behind conflict sensitivity, integration, and mainstreaming into that program. And I would like to frame this in terms of something I heard at USIP the other day. Did anyone attend the opening ceremony at USIP? So a few of you did. And you remember Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's, she quoted Eleanor Roosevelt as saying, it's not enough to talk about peace, and you need to believe in it, right? And it's not enough to believe in it, you have to practice it. So I would like to frame what I'm going to say in terms of talk, belief, and practice. And so as I thought about this program, it's a $40 million resilience strengthening program. It started roughly after independence of South Sudan, so sometime around 2012, I think. It went through, it's in its second iteration. The first round was the Jonglei Food Security Program. Now it's called Resilience Food Strengthening Program. And it will be concluding next year. So they asked me to go out there, I was out there last week, to do a learning review and propose some recommendations for what should come next in terms of the trauma awareness and resilience and social cohesion programming we're doing as part of that resilience strengthening program. If you've worked on resilience programs, you know they're multi-sectoral. And this one's not different from a lot of them. There's agriculture, food security, nutrition, DRR, WASH, livelihoods, microfinance, and I'm probably leaving something out. They do food for assets and food for education and so forth. And so let me begin with a little bit of context. I'm going to add just a few things to what my brother here said about the context. In Jonglei State, you have basically three major ethnic groups in this area, which are at various stages of conflict and reconciliation with each other. You have the Dinka, the Nuer, and the Merle. And there are other groups too. And when you think about it, what they've lived through over the last, well, since Sudan gained its independence in 1956, was it? They have experienced, if they're old enough, they've experienced 3 civil wars. So think about it like my grandparents, my parents, myself, and my kids. Pretty much all we've known is conflict and violent conflict with a few short periods in between of quiet and some stability. So this is the general context we're operating in. Now going back to around 2012, when this project was conceived, USAID, the mission there, was asking its partners to mainstream conflict sensitivity. And it wanted to do the same for all of its programs. That was, let's say, an ideal, a goal, which didn't happen for various reasons. So that was a lot of talk with a little bit of belief that if we did this, it would make a difference. And just so that we're on the same page here, my understanding of conflict sensitivity, the way I can remember it, is we've got 2 understands and an act, right? So the first one is you understand your context. The second understand is you understand how your project or your intervention is going to impact the context and how the context is going to impact your project, and then you act upon that understanding. So, CRS built in some justice and peace work into the project, and USAID says, no, take it out. We really don't want that at this point. And maybe you could understand why, because it was a period where everyone sort of was euphoric. The independence had just occurred. We thought that, you know, things were trending in the right direction and that conflict would be over and development would take place. And as you know, that didn't happen. So round about 2015, CRS decided that things weren't working as planned. We were probably intensifying and deepening divisions between and among groups. We weren't getting the results that we thought we would get because people were anxious, afraid. Some of them were suffering from depression. They just weren't as productive as they normally would be. Raids were occurring, attacks, abductions, killings, threats and so forth were commonplace. People couldn't go out to tend their fields, so they were becoming anxious over food. Would they have enough to eat? Could they feed their families? Don't even think about education or health. Those were really too distant. So we then took a different tack, and we began to integrate the trauma-informed approach to the resilience work. It was funded by CRS. USAID Food for Peace saw the results and said, we like what you're getting. Keep doing it. And on the next round, when we expanded it in 2017 to include social cohesion, they funded it. They funded it as part of a component. There's a little more history there. I won't have time to go into it, but maybe in the Q&A we can talk a little bit about that. So that's a little bit of the backstory. So you can see where talk became more belief, but it became belief because of practice. If we hadn't actually gone out there and started practicing it, the belief might not have grown to the point where Food for Peace said, yes, this is right. This should be a component, emotional and mental strengthening and resilience is part of the total resilience package. Now, there are several other things I could say about it. If we could put up the slide about social cohesion, I'll just make a quick mention of this. In 2017, we expanded the approach to take a broader social cohesion approach, mostly on a horizontal level. And for those of you who have your definitions of social cohesion, including CRS, and I see Nell Bolton in the room, she's our Global Peacebuilding Advisor, I hope she won't have a heart attack when she reads this definition, because this is what came out of the communities we were working in. This is not your standard textbook definition, but this is what people thought they needed with social cohesion. So you will see that about 5 of these bullets relate to the individual. This is what they felt needed to happen at the individual, the personal level. A lot of healing needed to take place there. And then the relationship of the individual to the group of which they were part of. And we call that the bonding. So you had 2 stages of what we call our binding, bonding, and bridging approach to social cohesion, our methodology. And they were very much locked into the binding and the bonding stages of the methodology. We didn't really get much into the bridging. So when I was out there last week and met youth groups and women's groups and traditional leaders, elders, and CRS staff working out there, I realized that this was really needed. We had to do this. But now we were at a point where you have communities with a lot of IDPs. People can't go home because they still fear they might be attacked. Their children could be abducted. The cattle could be raided. There are too many people still with guns. So there are shootings and killings because of scarce resources, a competition over water points during the dry season, and so forth. So it became apparent to us that really what we needed to do next was move to a bridging phase, where we had to bring in the Murle group in particular, because relationships had improved dramatically between the Nuer and the Dinka, but not the Murle had been excluded. And one of the comments, I'll just share one comment from that I heard in the women's group, was the conflict and fighting going on at the national level between the political leaders doesn't really concern us. That's not our problem. However, we're being impacted by it. So what's happening up at that level, trickles down and creates conflicts between the Nuer and the Dinka at the Jonglei state level, even though they feel like, hey, that's not our fight. We shouldn't really have to, be punished because these 2 leaders at the national level can't agree with each other. So what lessons do I feel we could take away from this experience? I think we've moved a lot. We've moved a lot over the last 5 to 7 years, from talk to belief to practice. And as I say, sometimes practice has to happen first before you get the belief. If you probably have experienced this in your own lives. If you start doing something, and people say if you do it for 21 days, it becomes a habit. But if you start doing something, you start believing that it can make a difference. So you have to get into the practice stage to intensify and deepen your belief, which then leads to more practice. I don't think the talk ever quite stops either, because you have to keep dialoguing about it. What are we learning? What did we learn from DRC, Myanmar, Western Equatoria, and all of your experiences? I'm sure you bring a lot of experience to this question and to this topic. That's really useful. But I do believe here, too, another thing to think about is if you start at that individual level, you get change at the personal level, it affects the relational level of change, and then it can affect the structural and cultural dimensions of change as well. And so what I'm proposing with our team for the next step is that we address the culture of bitterness, revenge, and violence that still persists in Greater Jonglei, and help people replace that culture with a culture more based on trust and tolerance, respect, mutuality, reciprocity, and so forth. So it's a big, tall order, but that strikes us as being the right next step to take, sort of a bridging to bring the Murle in, continue to strengthen the relationships between Dinka and Nuer, continue with the trauma awareness and resilience work so that everyone gets stronger personally and builds relationships within their own group and can do so with others. For CRS as an agency, I think we are embarking on a new agency strategy. It's not a real innovative title because we call it Vision 20, just like everyone else is calling their strategies Vision 2030 these days. But the advantage, I think, for us is it gives us 12 years now instead of these 5-year chunks to really work on transformational change. So I think as an agency now, we need to keep talking, but we need to do a lot more practicing. So for me, this would be like, here's the minimum bar. If we as peace builders, if we can't help our sectors and ourselves get over this bar, then wow, we probably need to go back to square one and work on conflict sensitivity as the minimum bar we got to get over if we're going to do some serious peace building. So I think it's incumbent on us this year to develop the guidelines, to work more on standards. You know, what does this mean? How do we do it? We've got a great case study from Jonglei State now. Probably deserves more attention than we've given it because it could be really instructive for us as an agency as well as for others. Thanks.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your great insights, for the experiences, and also for the inspiration. I guess now it's time for Q&A. And what we're going to do is we're going to take 3 questions at a time. We'll start with 1 round. We'll see where that takes us. And if we have time, we can go for a second round. So, yes, we have the gentleman over there.
Hi.
Yes.
My name is David Smith. I'm with the Forge Center for Peacebuilding and Humanitarian Education. And we actually we have a training program in the U.S. where we train people to work in conflict zones, and graduate students and professionals. So my question is, implicit in everything you're saying is that you need people to do this work. And as the work is changing, the nature of the people that you need are changing. So my question to you is that you have a room full of maybe aspiring humanitarian workers and peace builders. What are the types of qualities and backgrounds are you looking for people to work in the field? And maybe how has that changed over the last couple of years?
Thank you. Second question.
Thank you. My name's Andrew Moe. I work for the International Rescue Committee, and this is close to what I do. I lead IRC's global efforts around context analysis, conflict sensitivity. We have a set of kind of quality standards that we call our good and great standards. But coming back to the topic of humanitarian development nexus, whatever you want to call it, I was interested as far as some of the tensions that you all see between these types of programming. I know with Relief International as a organization that the identity might lean towards more humanitarian, how you wrestle between those two instances. And the specific question being, I think, conflict sensitivity can usually build on humanitarian principles, but sometimes recommendations coming out of conflict sensitivity may actually lead to potential violation of humanitarian principles, right? Like, if we're going to be thinking and working more politically savvy, is being totally needs-based and you're targeting the most appropriate approach, or do you have to manage these issues around social cohesion, around how to engage government actors that might also be a party to the conflict? What's the right balance, and what framework do you use as far as decision-making at the country level?
Great, thank you. Does anyone have a third question? If not, we'll go ahead and answer these two. Who would like to start first about the capacity and the changing needs and capacities?
I would just summarize by saying we need SME plus, subject matter expert plus. For a long time, we really emphasized on technical expertise, you know, let's say a WASH engineer or an education advisor, but people who didn't have experience working in such a context, people who do not have the skills to engage with communities, with leaders, diplomatic skills, humanitarian principles, you know. For example, anybody who would like to come there should do building better response kind of work, how the humanitarian, the cluster system works, those kinds of things which especially young professionals will not get it in schools. So opportunities for peer learning, for on-site learning, coaching, mentoring programs, I think would be very helpful, because it's difficult. A fresh graduate might be an excellent civil engineer or, you know, assigned in a WASH program, but has never interacted with the chiefs, with community leaders or women's groups. Becomes very difficult. Yes, they can do the design and everything, but to get it done, the social skills, I guess more anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists. In such context, for us, now we are seeing over 40% of South Sudanese have some form of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a huge problem. But not many people, not many agencies talk about the mental health situation, you know, trauma healing, recovery. I know CRS and some others are doing a little bit of work, but it's not enough. So we need a wide array of experiences and expertise. Thank you.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you said, Mesvin. I would just add to that, having gone through a graduate program for conflict analysis and resolution, and 20 years ago, aging myself. However, someone came up to me yesterday who was a very recent graduate from the same program and said, you know, I just don't feel like I have the skills to just walk into a job and do what I was, do what I just learned, apply all this learning that I just got. I feel like it's too theoretical and not practical enough. And I feel, and I'm sad, I was a little sad to hear that that's still the case 20 years on. And so, to answer your question, or respond a little bit to the question, David, is that we do need that practical experience, the how-to. And I would encourage universities or training programs to really integrate, even if it's like simple templates and checklists and things that are, tangibly usable. One thing that I do in a training program that I provide is to have a practicum. And so whoever the trainees are, they bring their issues to the table. They bring their challenges to the table. They have a design, they have a M&E plan, or they have a staffing issue, and they bring that to the table and say, I just don't know what to do in this conflict context. And, you know, we 9 times out of 10 are able to work through it as a participatory group. So that's my short addition.
Yeah, is it David? Yes. Thanks for the question. That's a tough one. And I'm going to give you Socrates' answer, know thyself. Because it's a difficult, you know, it's kind of a life journey for some people to discover that they want to be peace builders. I came to this about, I don't know, was it 10 years ago? And I was talking to an engineer last night over dinner who morphed into peace building. So he got his 2 licenses in civil engineering and some subfield of that, and decided that actually that's not really what he wanted to practice. A costly way of finding out. But for the last 5 years, I've participated in a summer peace building program at Monterey Institute, and I've had a chance to mentor a number of students in that program who are high school and college age, and they're discovering themselves. Is this something that they really want to do? There are other good programs out there too. Eastern Mennonite University has their summer Peace Building Institute, and there are others. But that might be a good way for young people to test the waters and discover themselves and say, okay, yeah, this is for me or not. And there are some who've gotten degrees from like the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame, come to work for CRS and then find out, the career path really isn't there for me. So then they morph into something else. But they've got that set of skills and maybe the passion and love for peace building that stays with them.
Can I just interject a question? I mean, a lot of people we see in our program become resident going into Peace Corps and going to those types of experiences. And those become the precursor experiences for professionals that you're looking for. So, I mean, those are the kind of setting up the stage for people after graduation for college to go into something, come back and realize they want to finish. I'll bet you have lots of Peace Corps volunteers in your staff because they've slept under a mosquito net.
Yep. You're looking at one.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I make some comments on is my colleague from IRC, is it? You talked about humanitarian principles also. Some examples how to balance. You talked about the balance. For example, a typical case in South Sudan would be where the government wouldn't allow humanitarian support to areas controlled by the opposition. They call IO, in opposition areas. It's to first of all think about the need in the area, safety, duty of care to your staff, second, and then also navigate this very sometimes sensitive political dynamic, but to make a way to be there for the people. So our principle as World Vision, we always say, if it's difficult and challenging, find a way to be there, find a way to get there. Of course, it requires a lot of maybe 3-4 paperworks in different levels and sometimes under very difficult conditions, but the humanitarian principle should be respected by all means, but priority should be to the most vulnerable who need the support of humanitarians. So working together is not a single organization's mandate, working together through mechanisms like NGO Forum, the Secretary, UN, OCHA, and all those, lobbying for access to areas that have difficulty is something that works very well. Thank you.
Okay, and my answer is going to sound cynical. I am not cynical, I promise. Okay, but I think the first thing is to realize that aid is never neutral. It's not neutral, and we're fooling ourselves if we're saying it's neutral. And I don't have the reference, but it's amazing. There's a very good reference. It's from Overseas Development Institute, and I can follow up and I can find the document for you. But it looks at the different principles, humanitarian principles versus development principles, and somewhere in the middle, there are these fragility principles and things that we have to do when we're working in fragile context. And, you know, do no harm, of course, is at the top of that. But, you know, like I mentioned before, like who we decide that we're going to work with is who we're saying is the legitimate authority to be able to provide those services. So we have to be able to understand that in fragility is context, 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 because somebody is allowing you to have access. You know, and at any point, this actor, that actor, that actor, whoever decides that you're not going to be there anymore, you're not there anymore. So in fragile states, it's context, context, context. And there's only a few organizations that really have the financial luxury to be able to be truly humanitarian. You know, MSF is a great example. Things go out of line, they're like, this is not meeting our principles, we're leaving, we get to pack up and go. Now, that's a bad thing for the population who's no longer getting services, but at least they're able to maintain their humanitarian principles. Organizations like Relief International and, you know, IRC, most NGOs that are trying to deliver these types of services, when we look at those humanitarian principles, we have to understand that level of independence is not really independent, because we're getting our money from a government, and a government has its objectives that it wants to see. Now, we're not saying that we're instruments of those governments, but we're fooling ourselves if we pretend we're completely independent in all these things. So it's context, context, context when it comes to fragile and violent and conflict-affected states. So.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Keith Burton, Claremont Lincoln University, and I just wanted to continue the conversation from the previous questions as it relates to preparing people for the work. And I do that because two thoughts come to my mind. One, savior complex. Number two, aid dependency. So what are we doing in our contexts to ensure that we develop the local folk, those who are the recipients, to do this work? You know, I believe that one thing that we should be doing as peace builders is trying to find a way that we will not be needed in certain areas. Now, something completely different in terms of a strategy that may not have been tried to this point. My hobby is genealogy. I'm wondering if, as we look at resolving conflicts, particularly tribal conflicts, if a DNA experiment would not be something that could possibly pique an interest amongst the people who find out, my goodness, we're cousins.
And would anyone like to comment on this? Or I see Robert.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. I've often thought I should do one, you know, just to see, you know, if my concept of where I come from is actually correct. But one of the comments I heard a lot last week was from the women, youth, and traditional leaders was, if we had more interactions between and among the Dinka and the subgroups, and then the Nuer and the Murle, and the women mentioned this one, including, you know, if we had festivals we could attend together, places we could go and have interaction and fun, that would lead to intermarriage, and then we would have less fighting and violence between and among each other, because we would obviously have an investment in this other group. Genetically, they probably already have, but that would be a more physical and obvious investment, and be a buffer against striking out. You're not going to strike out at your own clan, lineage, and people as easily as you might some other group. That topic came up last night, by the way, at dinner, and this gentleman from Kosovo said to me, well, where I come from, that doesn't make any difference. You can still intermarry and fight your relatives and your family.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Yes, please. Sorry, we can't hear you. Let me pass you on my mic.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marina. I'm from Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, also known as GPAC. My question would be directly on peace development, humanitarian nexus. What UN is doing, because part of the work that I'm doing with the UN in New York is working with a program called Peace and Development Advisors. And those groups are primarily based in the countries when there is no UN missions, meaning the humanitarian part is not addressed at all. And then there is a humanitarian side or different types of missions set up that is happening in country situations. And these missions are basically saying we do not need peace and development advisors because this is integrated in the work that we are doing, which for me seems to be a lot of separation between development work and humanitarian work still. So I mean, I guess my question is where it's all going and what kind of developments you will see in the future, and how we, I think, as a peace-building community can support merging, or even if we need to support merging, I guess.
I'll start it off anyway. I'm sure others have something to say about this. On the UN side, I mean, I've been recently looking at what bilaterals and multilaterals are doing in the conflict sensitivity space, and the UN is supposedly, I don't know in practice, this is the talk, but they supposedly have a UN-wide training that is online for all staff. Now, that's the talk, right? So now putting that into a belief and putting it into the practice is the big challenge. The only two, and I'm sure lots of you in the audience might have more information than I do, units of the or arms of the UN that I'm aware of that are that believe it and practice it consistently is UNDP, and then UNOPS, I think, is a lot more country specific, but there have been UNOPS programs who integrate it as well. But UNDP, I mean, they have their own analysis framework. They do systems thinking analysis with a very strong peace building lens. I've sat in trainings with UNDP friends. And then, just as an FYI, I mean, the World Bank, the EU, the EC, there are a lot of, again, a lot of talk. There's a lot written. There are trainings occurring for, staff or their own agency or organizational staff. How much that's being put into practice, I don't have that experience.
Just to add how it will work in a country base, I will just take South Sudan as an example. World Vision's global strategy is our promise to build brighter future for children. How we translated that in South Sudan, going across the Nexus and with all of it in its totality, is we say it's one promise, it's one program, and one story, which works with communities to build a vision and goals for each of the communities for all the needy areas, and wherever we operate based on the needs, and work with them to achieve those transformational change. So no separation. This is an emergency response. This is humanitarian response. or this is now development, we don't talk about that. So it's one package, a framework that brings all of these factors together in one program, and we want to talk about that one story.
All right, I think we have space for one last question or comment before closing. Yes, please. Okay, go ahead.
My name is Rindal Khail. I work at FHI 360, and kind of building on what you just said about working with local communities, because there are no lines when you are talking to them about this is development, humanitarian, and so forth. But if you're working on a specific activity where, you know, they don't have enough food for their family, as you mentioned, or like their focus is basic needs, and you're trying to like engage them in an activity to, you know, heal their trauma or like build social cohesion, so forth. To what extent do you see, you know, resistance from the people you're working with, whether staff or beneficiaries, to that approach? And when you see, if you see resistance, how have you handled it before?
Yes,
Hi.
okay, so the last question for today.
All right, thanks. Hi, I'm Michelle. Is this working? Yeah, okay. From Generations for Peace. We're a Jordanian-based and founded organization. And I really appreciated, Robert, I appreciated the social cohesion definition up there, because I think we do a lot of social cohesion work specifically in our Jordan offices and through locally based programming, and so I really just enjoyed that. But also wanted to ask about some of the program that we try to do and includes reflective practice, so doing that from the ground-based and locally based reflective practice. So when you're doing this programming, being adaptive and ready to kind of change on whim, and I think some of what you guys have touched on is this conflict sensitivity, and in that I assume there's a lot of need for really quick adaptations as well in programming and in systems. So on the larger scale, how do you include this more reflective practice, this ability to change and adapt as situations change quite quickly in these conflict areas?
Who would like to go? Sure, go ahead, Masfin.
I'll just echo what Mike said earlier. It's about context, context, context. When it comes to community level, we always maintain these basic principles of programming, but it depends on what is an emerging need in the area. So it's a consultation, a dialogue, and an assessment that is done and endorsed by community that we work. So in some communities, it could just be working on a school management system to strengthen an already somehow running school to make it work better. In some locations, it could be more focused on enhancing food production and productivity. When it comes to that level of area-based programming, will be based on the needs on that. But generally, the basic principles of conflict sensitivity, do no harm, centrality of protection, especially for places like South Sudan, ensuring children and all vulnerable are protected, they have adequate protection. Those basic principles will always be across the board, but of course the programs will be area-specific, context-specific. Thank you.
Yeah, I found that the staff were very receptive to it. Why? Two reasons, really. One was because they themselves, and I'm talking about the sector leads on these various resilient sectors, the community mobilizers, and the technical agents who went out to the field to do technical assistance. They found that they could get better results. They had connector projects, for example, building roads, dams, and dikes, and physical infrastructure that needed to bring people from different villages and groups together. It's going to be a road connecting, you know, one ethnic group's village to another, why you need to have both sides working on it. So that proved beneficial. And secondly, because they were in such a conflicted environment where everyone had suffered a form of trauma, much of it accumulated. You know, there's a thing called secondary trauma, where if you are helping somebody who's traumatized, eventually you yourself, you know, get affected indirectly. and you start to carry on someone else's trauma. So that builds up, and at some point people are going to crack unless they address that. So they were very happy to participate in the trauma awareness and resilience exercise, understand that better, become more aware of it and how it affects them and other people. And then they could also assist the stakeholders much better because they all had sort of a common understanding of this thing called trauma.
Unfortunately, the time is getting tight, and I'm sure there are a few hungry people in this room. But before we leave the room, I have a question for you to leave with. We're not going to answer it now, but it's just a reflection after this discussion. Obviously, conflict sensitivity is essential, whether we're humanitarian, development, or peace-building workers. There is no question that we need to integrate conflict sensitivity in the work that we do, whether it's at the grassroots development level and humanitarian level, or even at the organizational level. So my question to you is, and I'm referring back to what Robert said about Eleanor Roosevelt. Where are we at, both personally and as organizations, when it comes to the integration of conflict sensitivity? Are we at the talking stage? Do we believe in conflict sensitivity, or are we doing something about it? So I'm going to leave you with that. And I want to give a big thank you to the amazing panel that we had today. Thank you very much for some great insights.